I am here with Robin Black to chat about what is a very quiet period, I'm going to say, Robin, in mixed martial arts. We had some small events over the past weekend, but looking ahead, we've got World Series of Fighting this weekend, but no UFC for another 2 weeks. It's a relatively calm period in mixed martial arts. I don't feel that will be the case once we get more into the month of April.
Yeah, it's weird almost. You know, we've gotten so accustomed to every Saturday there's something. You know, we come out on Monday, we come out of whatever went down on the weekend, we talk about it, we are already looking ahead to next weekend. Today, we got nothing.
It's time for some self-reflection, I think, Robin. And that is what Hector Lombard had after his fight with Neil Magny. He has made the decision that he is going to return to 185 pounds. Do you like this move for Hector Lombard, considering what we got to see a pretty good sample size of him at 170 pounds and a really tough performance against Neil Magny? Is moving up in weight to 185 the answer for Hector, a very large individual for 170?
Yeah, he's a big dude, so he cuts a lot of weight, and that could have been part of his challenge, but he's a really short guy for 185 pounds. Like, just pick a 185 or Chael Sonnen. You know, when you're standing in a room with Chael Sonnen, this is a huge guy, and that is true of most of these guys. Weidman, when Weidman's here, he's a big cat. Luke Rockhold, I mean, these are big dudes, so he has to change the way he fights at 185, but it kind of suits him. He has to get in close, travel inside on the distance, and get his weight on guys, but, you know, he had a pretty great career at 185, so it's not the craziest thing.
I think that we're seeing with a lot of fighters, Jorge Masvidal, he was on the MMA Hour last week, and he was describing, you know, his decision to he is now permanently fighting at 170, because fighting at 155, he was describing, my entire training camp, so much of it is just focused on the weight. And it's other things that you just can't dedicate all of your time to. So much is wrapped around what you're eating, when you're eating it, making sure that you cut this amount on this day. And it's suddenly you're a professional weight cutter, and almost the fighting becomes secondary in some camps.
It's very true, and we're seeing a lot of that now. You're going to see a lot more people getting away from the big weight cut. You know, why did they do it? Well, if you're going to be 25 pounds heavier than me, I can't really have that. So you start dropping down weight classes. But that is something that came in through wrestling. And we're kind of getting away, we're working around wrestling now, where wrestling isn't the anchor to everything. Guys fight a lot more on the outside, and they're trying to get away from the wrestling. You get away from the wrestling, all of a sudden maybe you get away from the weight cutting. And people are spending more time to skill development. You know, what's really going to come down to in a fight is the skills that you have. So weight cutting, even some strength and conditioning, people are getting away from some of that.
And I think that wrestling mentality, that is a big reason why the weight cutting mentality is so prevalent in mixed martial arts, is because we've seen people come over from that. The difference being that when these guys were competing in college and even high school in wrestling, yes, weight cutting was part of it, but you were also wrestling every single weekend. You couldn't allow yourself to balloon up 30 pounds and then cut down. You were staying in that weight division all season long. You go to mixed martial arts and you'll see some guys who are very disciplined and they'll stay within range at the entire calendar year, but we've also seen many examples of guys who just naturally, they balloon up so much and then it's a big cut down, and you only have X amount of those big cuts during your career.
Originally, the thinking was, if we can find what our natural weight is, whatever that natural weight, and just kind of cut a few pounds beneath it, but people would find their natural weight and then cut 20 pounds underneath it. And just because you can cut 20 pounds and then put it back on the next day doesn't mean that you should. But wrestling as the anchor of fighting, people's answer to dealing with big, powerful wrestlers was become a big, powerful wrestler. And that doesn't have to be the answer. We're the Stephen Thompsons of the world, the Dominic Cruzes, who is also an incredible wrestler, and that helps. Even the John Jones of the world, who is a great wrestler, they get away from it. They fight more on the outside. They create more movement. Instead of dealing with a wrestler by out-wrestling him, they're dealing with wrestlers by avoiding them. And if you're going to do that, you need the energy. You don't need the size. And we'll see people getting away from weight cutting.
This is hopefully the final chapter on Bellator 149, and what a book that is to write. We did discuss the fact that Ken Shamrock and Kimbo had failed their post-fight drug test, but last week, MMAfighting.com reporting what substances they were for, both popping for nandrolone. Shamrock as well, you can tack on methadone to that as well. Now, the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, which is where that was the jurisdiction for this card, they're not a traditional sports commission, and they'll be suspended 90 days, and they also have the option to withhold a license from them for a further period of time. But You contrast this to what would happen if these two were in the UFC, and you're looking at 2-year suspensions for both of these. There's a giant discrepancy here between what Texas is suspending you for and what the USADA jurisdiction would be providing here. But nonetheless, I think that Bellator 149, it's kind of the best and worst of what Bellator has presented this year. It was an incredible record-setting night for Bellator, but it produced an awful fight, a near casualty, which is not an over-exaggeration with Dada 5000, and at the end of it, 2 of the key stars failing their drug tests. It just seemed like everything can be encompassed in that 149 card.
Yeah, and this is what you get when you do stuff like this. You know, it's just one of those things. Bellator really should suspend them. They should at least make it look like they're against this kind of thing. That's important. But I think the most important thing, the thing that I keep coming back to, is I feel bad for Ken Shamrock. You worry about him. We've met Ken. He seems to be a really nice guy. You look at, at least I do, look at these pioneers as really important building blocks and people that need to be taken care of. And when you're taking methadone, it's most likely because you've developed some reliance on some type of pain medication. And that happens to these athletes. And you just worry about a guy like that who's a good dude, who's done great things in the sport. And where's he at physically? What's his life like now? You know, you worry about a guy like that.
Scott Coker is a very sensible individual. I think most would agree. As he sits back and looks at, and he has some time to remove himself from this event. On paper, you need to produce record-setting numbers, and he did that night. But you also sit back, you look at it that we got a massive warning sign here. We nearly had an individual that could have died in one of these fights. And how he got into the cage that night, those are questions you can ask. You also have older fighters that are on steroids too, that ended up getting into the cage. Do you sit back and does it give you at least a cause for pause here of what are we doing and worrying about what could have been the worst case scenario here and where our company is had that happened?
Yeah, which of the 2 or 3 possible worst case scenarios? It's bad. And you're absolutely right. Everybody who knows Scott Coker just has only good things to say about him. His track record shows he's highly intelligent. He cares about the sport. So you have to ask yourself, how much of this is Scott Coker doing what he's got to do? And how much of it is Viacom saying, just get me numbers. I don't care what it is. And I feel like it's Viacom that needs to learn that lesson. That's the feeling you get. Scott Coker is one man who's part of a machine. He's got a big leadership role. But, you know, who's the one at the helm kind of saying, we need to do more of this? Because whoever that guy is, he's got to stop doing this.
Yeah, it's, you know, we often talk about things, whether it's good for the sport, bad for the sport. 95% of the time, they really don't have a giant bearing on things. But all it would have taken the last week when they were debating this in New York, someone wants to point to some of these things that happened at this event. There was definitely some concern, and some of it's warranted, some of it's not. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot you can learn from that event in Houston.
Think of it. You got one juiced up guy beating on another guy who ends up hospitalized. I mean, just draw the lines, you know?
Final thing here, you have recently completed your upcoming album drop, your next breakdown. It's going to involve Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones. Going into this, did you have any thoughts from the first fight that maybe your thinking changed, preparing for this breakdown, researching these two, and looking at this rematch that's coming up in April?
You know, before I went and looked back at the fight, I looked back at every other fight that they ever had. And the one thing I drew away from it was just how great Daniel Cormier really is, how talented he is, especially in close. And then when I went back and watched that fight, with that knowledge in mind, you see how special Jones is, because he was really, Cormier's best range is in tight, get in close to you, beat you up at the inside ranges, and Jones either beat him at those ranges or at least fought to a draw, and then he can always beat you up from the outside. And it's going to be tricky for Cormier. He has to get in. When Jones can hit you from here and you can't hit him from there, that thing is something that needs to be overcome, and he always has that. But it was a beautiful first fight, and it's going to be cool.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be a fascinating one to see, as we've talked about, the changes that Daniel Cormier makes for this next fight coming up. April the 23rd, it's UFC 197, but their next card is going to be happening from Croatia. We're going to have a preview show for you coming out Thursday, April the 7th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time with Robin Black, John Ramsey, and myself previewing that entire card, and the undercard will be airing here on Fight Network in Canada. Note the special Sunday afternoon, noon Eastern start time with 4 fights airing here on Fight Network.